Two teenagers just got arrested in Texas. Not for what happened to their friend in the water, for what they did with his phone after. They threw it in a ditch. One of them opened it first and wiped every message between himself and the boy who never surfaced again. That phone, dumped, deleted, hidden, is the exact piece of evidence that turned a tragedy into a felony case.
We have a major break tonight to tell you about in the death of a North Texas teen. It was supposed to be a fun day of fishing for three young men at Lake Ray Hubbard. Instead, it turned deadly after the group jumped in to swim, and 18-year-old Daniel Erving never resurfaced. Now, months later, police have arrested a 19-year-old they say tried to cover up and hide what actually happened that day.
Now hold on to that. Because hundreds of miles away, in a case that's had this whole country talking for weeks, there's another phone. Missing content, deleted messages. A mother who says she tracked it down herself before investigators ever got near it.
A reasonable-minded person would know. If you are not guilty of a crime, why would you throw away his clothes and delete messages and not even call his mother?
If a phone was enough to bring real criminal charges in Texas, what does that mean for the ones sitting at the center of the Nolan Wells case? Quick thing before we get into it. If this is your first time here, we build out true crime documentaries like this every week, so hit subscribe and drop a comment telling me what state you're watching from tonight. Tonight, a fresh autopsy finding nobody's fully explained, a federal statement most people are misreading, and a young woman whose account of Nolan's last minutes doesn't match what his friends told investigators. Let's get into it. Before we go any further, let's be straight with you. These are two completely separate cases. Two different states, two different families, two different sets of facts. Nothing here is claiming they're the same story. What we're doing tonight is simpler than that. Laying these cases side by side and asking what one of them, already decided by prosecutors, can tell us about the one that isn't. So, let's start with Texas, because that's the case that actually has an outcome. April 13th, Lake Ray Hubbard, just outside Dallas. 18-year-old Daniel Erving heads out with two friends, 19-year-old Lucas Rowe and a 17-year-old who hasn't been publicly named. All three jump off a railroad bridge into the water below. Daniel comes up once. Calls out, goes under. He never comes back up. Here's where the case turns. According to the arrest affidavit, the two boys who made it back to shore didn't call 911, didn't call Daniel's mother. Instead, they left. On the way out, they tossed Daniel's clothes into a tree line and threw his phone into a roadside ditch. Rowe later told detectives he'd gone into that phone first and deleted every message between him and Daniel because he knew an investigation was coming and he didn't want to be part of it. 3 months later, on July 9th, Dallas police arrested both of them, not for Daniel's drowning, for tampering with evidence, a third-degree felony built entirely around what they did with his belongings in the hours after he disappeared. And that's the detail worth sitting with. This wasn't one bad decision made in a panic. It was a sequence. Leave the scene, ditch the clothes, ditch the phone, wipe the messages. Fear explains a lot in true crime cases like this one. It's a lot harder to stretch fear across 4 separate, deliberate choices. Here's where these two stories start to intersect. Ben Crump, the civil rights attorney representing both families, hasn't shied away from putting these cases next to each other. Talking about Daniel, he's put it bluntly. 2 friends picked him up, went out on the water with him, and came back without him. Sound familiar? That's almost word for word how Crump and Reverend Al Sharpton have described Nolan Wells, a young man who left with a group of friends and was the only one who didn't make it home. But Crump's been careful about what he's actually claiming. He's not saying one case proves the other. What he keeps pointing to is a pattern. The delay in reporting, the phone that goes missing or gets wiped, the friend group that goes quiet, and an official ruling that lands early, sometimes before all the evidence is even in. Sharpton, who stood alongside Nolan's family at multiple press conferences, has walked that same careful line. He won't call either case open and shut, but he's insisted the pattern itself, delayed calls, missing evidence, quick conclusions, deserves real scrutiny, no matter what ultimately caused either young man's death. That distinction matters. This pattern deserves scrutiny is not the same claim as this pattern proves a crime. Both men have tried to hold that line publicly, even as the public conversation around both cases has, at times, run right past it. To be fair to what's actually being said here, neither Crump nor Sharpton has claimed these cases are identical, or that Nolan's friends did what Roe and the second teen in Texas are now charged with doing. What they're pointing to is a shape, a sequence that keeps repeating in cases like these, regardless of the state, regardless of the family. Whether that shape says something about how scared teenagers tend to react, or something more troubling about which victims get believed right away, and which ones get an early, convenient answer instead. That's the exact question both of these cases are forcing into the open. Here's the detail that makes this Texas arrest matter so much for understanding Nolan's case. And it's easy to miss if you're not paying close attention.
To conduct an independent investigation as to the cause of death of Mr. Daniel Erving. Now you may ask, why do we need an independent investigation? That is because this family has lost confidence in the system that is supposed to protect them. This family has a distrust of the Dallas Police Department. They have not given this death of an 18-year-old Daniel Erving the urgency it deserves and demands.
The Dallas County Medical Examiner had already ruled on Daniel's death. Cause, drowning. Manner, accidental. That ruling came before the arrests, and it hasn't been reversed by them. Right now, in the same case file, you've got an official finding that says this was a tragic accident, sitting right next to felony charges against the two people who were there when it happened. That's not a contradiction. It's two separate questions, answered separately. Question 1. How did Daniel die? Officially, an accident. Question 2. What did the people who were with him do afterward? The answer to that one is, they allegedly broke the law to protect themselves. This is the single most important thing to carry into the rest of tonight's story. A family does not have to choose between accepting a death was accidental and still demanding real accountability for what happened next. Daniel's case proves both can exist in the same file at the same time. And there's a bigger principle buried in that, one that reaches way past either of these two cases. In situations involving young people, water, and a friend group that doesn't call for help right away, the public tends to collapse two totally different questions into one. Did somebody cause this death? And did somebody try to cover it up afterward? Those questions carry different legal standards, different evidence, different outcomes entirely. Daniel's case shows you can get a clean answer to the first question, accident, while a completely separate legal process plays out around the second. Part of why that distinction gets lost is simple. Headlines. Teen charged in friend's drowning death hits a lot harder than the accurate version. Teen charged with tampering with evidence after friend's accidental drowning. Only the second one is actually true. That gap between the dramatic version and the accurate one is worth remembering for the rest of this video, and for any true crime documentary coverage of either case going forward. Legal experts who've weighed in on Daniel's case draw a useful line here, and it's one worth carrying straight into how Nolan's case gets judged too. Failing to report a death right away and actively getting rid of evidence tied to it are two very different things under the law. The first can sometimes be explained by panic or fear. Courts often treat it that way. The second requires a level of deliberate decision-making that's a lot harder to wave off as just fear. Whichever category ends up applying to Nolan's friends, if charges ever come at all, will likely decide whether his case ends up looking like Daniel's, or like something else entirely. So what does that look like in practice? When investigators work a case like this, they're not just asking one question, did somebody cause this death? They're asking a whole separate set of narrower ones. Did anyone there know or reasonably suspect that a person was missing or in danger and fail to report it? Did anyone take possession of belongings, a phone, keys, clothes, and either sit on them without telling authorities or actively get rid of them? Did anyone give an account that later turns out to be demonstrably false? Each of those can become its own separate charge, completely independent of whatever the medical examiner rules about cause of death. Daniel's case answered several of those questions definitively, laid out in a documented affidavit. Nolan's case, as of tonight, hasn't answered any of them with that same certainty. Not yet. So, here's the fast version, for anyone just tuning into this story for the first time. 18-year-old Nolan Wells, a wide receiver at Southwest Mississippi Community College, headed out to Horn Island, a remote barrier island off the Mississippi coast, with a group of friends on July 4th. He didn't come back with them. His body was recovered from the water 2 days later. His friends told investigators he chose to stay behind on the island, planning to catch a ride back later with someone else. He didn't have his phone on him, didn't have his keys. Both turned up afterward, in his friend's possession, not his. Around 11 that night, one of the friends called the Coast Guard. But the Jackson County Sheriff's Office didn't formally request Coast Guard assistance until roughly noon the next day, a 13-hour gap that's never been fully explained, publicly or otherwise. The Sheriff's Office came out early, saying they suspected an accidental drowning, no foul play, a conclusion delivered before the state's own autopsy results were even back. Nolan's family didn't accept that. They flew his body to Washington, D.C. for an independent autopsy, partly funded by Colin Kaepernick, and brought in civil rights attorney Ben Crump. Notice something here. 2 young men who never knew each other, lived in different states, died months apart, and yet the language around both of them has been almost identical. Respectful, well-liked, the kind of son a parent never pictured burying. That's not a coincidence of storytelling. That's simply what the people who loved each of them have been saying, independently, thousands of miles apart, describing 2 different young men whose only real connection is the water, the friends who came back without them, and the questions that followed. And it's worth naming honestly why cases like these pull this kind of attention in the first place. Young men, water, a friend group that returns without them, a family left piecing together fragments afterward. That shape feels recognizable, which makes it tempting to treat every new case that fits it as automatic proof of something bigger. It isn't necessarily on its own. What it is a genuine reason to look closely at both cases individually, and then honestly ask what actually lines up and what doesn't. Outside that one final day, their lives looked nothing alike. Nolan was heading into his first full season with a college program, an entire career ahead of him. Daniel's family describes him with that same warmth. An amazing son his mother still can't fully explain losing. Different schools, different sports, different states. The only thread connecting their final hours is the water, the friends who made it back, and the questions that have followed both families ever since. Since then, Nolan's case has produced its own major finding, one worth understanding precisely, not blowing out of proportion. Independent forensic pathologist Dr. Roger Mitchell, president of the National Medical Association, conducted a second autopsy on July 10th. His conclusion, read publicly at a press conference in Chicago: cause and manner of death remain undetermined, pending further investigation. Alongside that, Mitchell documented one specific physical detail: a focal area of discoloration in the deep, soft tissue on the back of Nolan's head, roughly 12 inches by 8. Critically, the skin above it and the bone beneath it showed no damage. No laceration, no fracture. Crump has said this pathologist can't rule out foul play, specifically injury to the neck, partly because the state's own medical examiner had already retained Nolan's trachea and hyoid bone before this second exam even happened. Worth being precise here, too. More detailed reporting since that press conference describes this sequencing as fairly standard procedure between 2 separate autopsies done at different times, not confirmed evidence of anyone trying to obstruct the process. Both things can be true. This was likely ordinary procedure, and it still limited what the second exam could confirm. Toxicology, from both the state and the independent side, is still outstanding. And that single missing test is what this entire case is still waiting on. It's worth understanding why toxicology carries so much weight here, because it explains why this whole case keeps circling back to the same missing piece. Drowning causes fluid to build up in the lungs, the body shutting down from oxygen deprivation. A drug overdose can produce that exact same fluid buildup through a very similar process. Looking at the lungs alone often can't tell the two apart. That's why, in forensic pathology, drowning tends to get treated as a diagnosis of exclusion, something you confirm only after ruling out the alternatives first, especially an overdose. Toxicology is the test that actually does that ruling out, and it typically takes weeks. To be clear, there's been no suggestion whatsoever that drugs played any role in what happened to Nolan. This explanation exists purely to clarify why a conclusive cause of death can't be issued without this one test coming back. And it's worth being fair to both examiners here, rather than assuming bad faith on either side. A state medical examiner's office retaining tissue samples and dissecting organs during a standard autopsy is completely normal procedure, whether or not a second independent exam follows later. None of that is unique or suspicious on its own. What makes it notable in this case specifically is simply how much public attention and distrust has built around the state's process, enough that ordinary procedural steps have ended up scrutinized and in some cases framed with more suspicion than they may actually deserve. Now, about that discoloration finding, it's worth being precise about both its size and what it actually does and doesn't prove. 12 by 8 inches covers a genuinely substantial portion of the back of someone's skull, large enough that a careful pathologist would want a clear explanation for it, not just a passing note. But size alone doesn't establish cause. Discoloration that large can sometimes come from something as ordinary as post-mortem blood settling, depending on how a body was positioned after death, and for how long, especially after several days in warm Gulf water. And that's exactly what makes comparing this to Daniel's case so useful. Daniel's medical examiner reached a clean, confident ruling. Nolan's independent examiner reached the opposite, an honest admission that the evidence in front of him wasn't enough to reach a confident conclusion either way. Now here's a thread that connects directly to the central contradiction that's defined this case from the start. A young woman, referred to publicly only by her first name, Katie, was the last person confirmed to have spoken with Nolan before he disappeared. For weeks, her account existed only secondhand, filtered through her own mother and sister, posting online to correct rumors that had spiraled out of control. That changed recently. Katie sat down face to face with Nolan's mother, Christine. And according to Christine, what Katie told her doesn't match what the boys have said. Here's the detail worth understanding carefully, because it's more nuanced than a flat contradiction. According to Katie, Nolan told her he planned to head back and rejoin his friend's boat before they left the island. According to the friends, Nolan told them the opposite, that he wanted to stay behind with her by his own choice. Katie never actually watched Nolan get on that boat. She's describing an intention he stated to her, not something she personally witnessed. That distinction matters. It doesn't necessarily mean one person is lying and one is telling the truth. It could mean something changed in the gap between Nolan telling Katie one thing and whatever happened next, a gap nobody's been able to explain. Either way, this is the first time that account has come from Katie herself, directly to the one person who needs it most, instead of through a chain of secondhand relatives. And it's worth sitting with how significant that shift actually is. For nearly 2 weeks, one of the two most important accounts of Nolan's final minutes existed only as a rumor, filtered through people who weren't even there for the conversation. That gap left room for secondhand claims, anonymous posts, and speculation to fill in where Katie's actual words should have been. A direct, in-person conversation between her and Christine closes that gap for the first time. It's arguably one of the more consequential developments in this entire investigation, even though it happened quietly, with no press conference attached to it. There's a quieter parallel here too, one that loops back to the phone thread running through both of these cases. Christine has said she tracked Nolan's phone herself, before investigators ever located it, and that what she and her sister found, once they got into his Snapchat, didn't match what they expected from a son who documented outings like this one constantly. Tamika Erving, Daniel's mother, described a similarly maddening experience of her own. being told by police that Daniel's phone couldn't even be searched for until after his body was recovered, because of legal restrictions on locating a device before someone is officially confirmed missing. In both cases, these mothers describe a system built around procedural caution rather than urgency, the exact kind of caution that, intentionally or not, gives anyone with something to hide extra time to make sure it stays hidden. It's also worth noting what it means that this new detail about Katie came through a private conversation, not another public statement. Nearly every other major development in this case, the FBI statement, the autopsy findings, the grand jury referral, has come through some kind of formal announcement. This one didn't. It came through two people simply sitting down together. And that suggests this case isn't only being fought in press conferences and legal filings. Real conversations are still happening in the background too, ones that may end up mattering just as much, even without a camera there to record them. This case has also drawn formal federal involvement, and it's worth being precise about exactly what that does and doesn't signal. The FBI's Jackson Field Office released an official statement confirming its assistance has centered specifically on interstate threats made against people connected to this investigation. Threats serious enough to cross state lines and fall under federal jurisdiction. The statement was explicit that the Jackson County Sheriff's Office remains the lead agency from the start of this case through whatever comes next. Support, not a takeover. That federal involvement lands at the same time this case is moving toward a formal grand jury process. Following a meeting between Nolan's parents and Jackson County District Attorney Angel Myers Mathis, Crump confirmed the case will be handed to a grand jury once the underlying investigation wraps up. The DA's office has clarified directly that this referral is standard procedure for unnatural or suspicious deaths in that county. Not on its own confirmation that criminal charges are coming. Both developments, the FBI statement and the grand jury referral, represent real institutional movement. Neither one by itself tells us what this investigation will ultimately conclude. And it's worth being precise about why the FBI's involvement isn't the ominous signal a lot of early online speculation treated it as. Federal agencies routinely step in to assist local law enforcement on interstate threat cases, entirely separate from whatever underlying case those threats are tied to. That's exactly the framework here. The threats made against people connected to this investigation are what triggered federal jurisdiction, not any suggestion that Nolan's death itself is being treated as a federal crime. That distinction matters, because in a case generating this much attention, it's easy to read every new institutional development as evidence that something bigger is being uncovered, when sometimes it just reflects standard interagency cooperation on a genuinely separate problem. In this case, protecting people from threats that have nothing directly to do with how Nolan actually died. Advocacy groups following both Nolan's and Daniel's cases have started treating them together as one example of a specific recurring failure point. Not necessarily in how these two young men died, but in what happens in the minutes and hours right after. In both cases, the people physically present when something went wrong didn't call authorities right away. In both cases, a phone that should have documented the day instead became a source of suspicion. In both cases, official investigators reached an early conclusion: accidental drowning, no foul play, that the families publicly rejected as premature. And in both cases, it took an outside attorney and outside resources just to secure the level of scrutiny advocates say any family should get by default, without having to fight for it first. None of that proves either case involves anything beyond a tragic accident, compounded by panicked, poor decisions from scared teenagers. Panic is real. Not every failure to call for help reflects guilt about causing harm. Sometimes it's just fear of consequences for something else entirely. Underage drinking, or simply being scared of how a chaotic night is going to look to the adults in their lives. Daniel's case actually demonstrates that distinction directly. The charges against Rowe and the second teen are for what they did after Daniel went under, not for causing his drowning in the first place. But that distinction is exactly what both families are still fighting to have taken seriously. The idea that even if no one intended harm, choosing silence and self-protection over a phone call for help is its own kind of failure, one that deserves real accountability, not a quiet, accidental ruling that closes the book before every question's been answered. It's also worth noting the NAACP has now formally entered Nolan's case, passing a resolution calling on local, state, and federal authorities, including the Department of Justice, to conduct a complete, transparent review. That kind of institutional weight didn't attach to Daniel's case in quite the same way, at least not from a national civil rights organization specifically. And it's worth acknowledging directly why that is. Daniel's case, as reported, didn't carry the same racial dynamic that's been central to public discussion of Nolan's. A young black man whose friend group was reportedly predominantly white. That dynamic has shaped which organizations and public figures have chosen to get involved in Nolan's case specifically. It's a real, separate layer to this story, distinct from the shared pattern around phones, delayed reporting, and early conclusions that connects both cases more broadly. Crump and Sharpton have both raised that racial dimension directly, more than once, in Nolan's case, while being careful, as covered earlier, not to claim it alone proves what actually happened to him. Understanding both threads together, the shared procedural pattern and the racial context specific to Nolan's case, matters for seeing this comparison clearly, instead of flattening either case into something simpler than it actually is. Now let's bring this back to where we started tonight, because this is where the comparison between these two cases gets genuinely sharp. In Daniel Erving's case, the phone isn't a mystery anymore. It's a documented, charged crime. According to the arrest affidavit, Rowe and the second teen physically got rid of Daniel's phone, specifically to keep it away from investigators. And Rowe separately deleted his own messages with Daniel once he realized an investigation was coming. That's not a family suspicion anymore. That's an alleged fact, sitting in a criminal filing, attached to a felony charge. In Nolan's case, everything we know about the phone still comes from the family's own account. Christine says she tracked the device herself, using a location-sharing app before investigators ever got to it. When she and her sister finally got access, she says they found nothing from that entire day. No saved photos, no saved Snapchat content, despite Nolan's well-documented habit of capturing exactly these kinds of moments. So, here's the question worth asking directly. Could this become Nolan's version of what the phone became in Daniel's case? The single piece of evidence that produces criminal charges, regardless of what the autopsy ultimately says about cause of death. The honest answer is, it could, but only if it actually gets confirmed. Right now, what Christine has described is a family looking at a device themselves, not a professional forensic extraction capable of proving something was deliberately deleted, rather than simply lost through ordinary app behavior, like Snapchat's own automatic content expiration. That's exactly why the mutual, coordinated phone inspection both sides have agreed to matters so much. It's the process that could turn this from a family's suspicion into something with the same evidentiary weight Daniel's case already carries. An actual, confirmed act of tampering, chargeable entirely on its own, separate from however Nolan's cause of death is ultimately ruled. If that inspection turns up anything close to what Texas investigators found, this stops being a suspicious detail. It becomes the same kind of standalone criminal question that already produced 2 arrests in Daniel's case. It's worth walking through what a forensic download would actually need to show to move this from suspicion to something legally comparable. Investigators, or the family's own retained experts, would need to prove that specific content existed on the device at some point that day, and was then deliberately removed by a specific person at a specific time. That's a meaningfully higher bar than simply confirming the phone shows nothing from July 4th. Digital forensics can often recover data that looks deleted, since very little digital information is ever truly gone the moment someone hits delete. If that recovery process surfaces content and shows it was removed during the exact window the friends had possession of the phone, rather than automatically expiring through Snapchat's own settings, that's the kind of finding that turned Daniel's case from a mother's suspicion into 2 felony arrests. Nolan's case is standing right at that same threshold, waiting on the examination both sides have already agreed to conduct. One caution worth including here, and it applies to both cases equally. Location tracking apps depend heavily on network signal and coverage, and a group of people gathered closely together, all using their phones at once, can genuinely interfere with each other's signal strength, sometimes producing exactly the kind of inconsistent location data both these families have described. That doesn't make either family's account meaningless. It just means drawing firm conclusions from a consumer tracking app before an actual forensic download happens, risks moving faster than the evidence can currently support. There's one more legal layer worth adding here, about how tampering charges actually hold up in court once they're filed. Prosecutors generally need to prove intent, that the person accused knew the evidence was relevant to an investigation and acted specifically to conceal, alter, or destroy it. In Daniel's case, Rowe's own admission to detectives, that he deleted messages because he knew an investigation was coming, supplied that intent directly, in his own words. That's exactly what makes a tampering charge relatively straightforward to bring. Without a similar admission, or forensic proof clearly tying deliberate deletion to the timeline of the investigation, prosecutors in a case like Nolan's would have to build that same intent circumstantially, through who had the phone, for how long, and what a forensic download ultimately shows was removed, and when. That's a heavier lift than what Texas prosecutors had in front of them, which is part of why the phone inspection in Nolan's case carries so much weight. It may be the single piece of evidence capable of supplying exactly the kind of proof this whole comparison keeps circling back to. One of the sharpest differences between these two cases isn't the evidence at all. It's the pace. Daniel died in April. It took 3 full months and sustained public pressure from advocacy groups before any arrests happened. Nolan died in July, and within roughly 2 weeks, his case had already drawn FBI involvement, national coverage, a district attorney publicly committing to a grand jury process, and an independent autopsy funded by a former NFL star. That speed, this early, is close to unprecedented. That raises an uncomfortable question. Did Nolan's case move faster because investigators genuinely prioritized it from day one? Or did it move faster because of the public and media pressure that built almost immediately? Pressure that simply didn't exist for Daniel's family in those same early weeks. Advocates following both cases have pointed toward the second explanation, that public attention, more than procedural fairness, is often the real variable determining how fast any family gets real answers. Part of that gap likely comes down to how each story reached a national audience in the first place. Nolan's case had an immediate visual hook, a remote barrier island, a 13-hour Coast Guard delay, a photo that spread online within days. Daniel's case unfolded quietly, in local Dallas coverage, for months, before advocacy groups pushed it into wider view. That difference may say less about which case authorities considered more serious, and more about which one happened to generate the kind of momentum capable of forcing institutions to move faster. Before we close, it's worth listening to what these two families have actually said they want, because it's more modest than the headlines around either case suggest. Daniel's mother, Tamika Erving, hasn't demanded automatic convictions. Her attorney has asked investigators to follow the facts wherever they lead, and bring whatever charges those facts support. What she's pushed back against isn't a specific outcome. It's 3 months of feeling like nobody outside her own corner was treating her son's death with real urgency. Christine Wells has said almost the identical thing about Nolan, not a predetermined conclusion. In her own words, the same respect anyone else would be given. Two families, thousands of miles apart, who've never met, represented by the same attorney, have independently landed on nearly identical language for what justice actually looks like to them. Not a guaranteed result. A guarantee that the process treats their son's life as seriously as anyone else's would be treated. So does Daniel's arrest actually predict anything for Nolan's case? Not directly. These remain two separate proceedings, moving at two different speeds, built on two different sets of facts. But Daniel's case does prove something worth holding on to as Nolan's moves forward. An accidental ruling and real accountability aren't mutually exclusive, and a phone, once it's actually forensically examined, has already been enough in one case, just like this one, to turn a family's suspicion into an arrest. Nolan Wells was 18. Daniel Erving was 18. Neither of them is here to say what actually happened in their final minutes. What's left are two families still waiting, in Christine's own words, for the same respect anyone else would receive, and a phone, sitting at the center of Nolan's case right now, that a case just like his already proved can be the difference between a quiet, accidental ruling and real accountability for whatever happened after. We'll keep following both of these cases. As Nolan's phone inspection happens, as toxicology results come back from both sides, and as this investigation moves toward a grand jury, we'll bring you the facts as we actually get them, verified, and not a moment before. If this case has had you hooked, drop a comment and let me know where you're watching from tonight. And subscribe, because we'll be back the second either of these cases moves.